Sapiens Chapter 6 Building Pyramids. The agricultural revolution is one of the most controversial events in history. Some participants proclaim that it set humankind on the road to prosperity and progress. Others insist that it led to perdition. This was the turning point, they say, where sapiens cast off its innate symbiosis with nature and sprinted toward greed and alienation. Whichever direction the road led, there was no going back. Farming enabled populations to increase so radically and rapidly that no complex agricultural society could ever again sustain itself if it returned to hunting and gathering. Around 10,000 BC, before the transition to agriculture, Earth was home to about 5 to 8 million nomadic foragers. By the first century AD, only 1 to 2 million nomadic foragers no, remained, mainly in Australia, America, and Africa, but their numbers were dwarfed by the world's 250 million farmers. The vast majority of farmers lived in permanent settlements. Only a few were nomadic shepherds. Settling down caused most people's turf to shrink dramatically. Ancient hunter gatherers usually lived in territories covered many dozens, even hundreds of square miles. Home was the entire territory with its hills, streams, woods, and open sky. Peasants, on the other hand, spent most of their days working in a small field or orchard. And their domestic lives centered on cramped structure of wood, stone, or mud, measuring no more than a few dozen feet. A house. The typical peasant developed a very strong attachment to this structure. This was a far reaching revolution whose impact was psychological as much as architectural. Henceforth, attachment to my house and separation from the neighbors became the psychological hallmark of a much more self centered creature. The new agricultural territories were not only far smaller than those of ancient foreigners, but also more artificial. Aside from the use of fire, hunter gatherers made few deliberate changes to the lands in which they roamed. Farmers, on the other hand, lived in artificial human islands that they laboriously carved out of the surrounding wilds. They cut down forests, dug canals, cleared fields, built houses, plowed furrows, and planted fruit trees in tidy rows. The resulting artificial habitat was meant only for humans and their plants and animals and was often fenced off by walls and hedges. Farmer families did all they could to keep out wayward weeds and wild animals. If such interlopers made their way in, they were driven out. If they persisted, their human antagonists sought ways to exterminate them. Particularly strong defenses were erected around the home. From the dawn of agriculture until this very day, billions of humans armed with branches, swatters, shoes, and poison sprays have waged relentless war against the diligent ants, furtive roaches, and adventurous spiders and misguided beetles that constantly infiltrate the human domicile. For most of history, these man made enclaves remained very small, surrounded by expanses of untamed nature. The Earth's surface measures about 200 million square miles, of which 60 million is land. As late as AD 1400, the vast majority of farmers, along with their plants and animals, clustered together in an area of just 4.25 million square miles, 2% of the planet's surface. Everywhere else was too cold, too hot, too dry, too wet, or otherwise unsuited for cultivation. This minuscule 2% of the Earth's surface constituted the stage on which history unfolded. People found it difficult to leave their artificial islands. They could not abandon their houses, fields, and granaries without grave risk of loss. Furthermore, as time went on, they accumulated more and more things, objects, not easily transportable, that tied them down. Ancient farmers might seem to us dirt poor, but a typical family possessed more artifacts than an entire forager tribe. The coming future. While agricultural space shrank, agricultural time expanded. Foragers usually didn't waste much time thinking about next month or next summer. Farmers sailed in their imagination years and decades into the future. Foragers discounted the future because they lived from hand to mouth and could only preserve food or accumulate possessions with difficulty. Of course, they clearly engaged in some advanced planning. The creators of the cave paintings of Chauvet-Lachaud and Altamira almost certainly intended them to last for generations. Social alliances and political rivalries were long term affairs. It often took years to repay a favor or to avenge a wrong. Nevertheless, in the subsistence economy of hunting and gathering, there was an obvious limit to such long term planning. Paradoxically, it saved foragers a lot of anxieties. There was no sense in worrying about things that they could not influence. The agricultural revolution made the future far more important than it had ever been before. Farmers must always keep the future in mind and must work in its service. The agricultural economy was based on a seasonal cycle of production, compromising long months of cultivation followed by short peak periods of harvest. On the night following the end of a plentiful harvest, the peasants might celebrate for all they were worth, but within a week or so they were up again dawn for a long day in the field. Although there was enough food for today, next week, and even next month, they had to worry about next year and the year after that. Concern about the future was rooted not only in seasonal cycles of production, but also in the fundamental uncertainty of agriculture. Since most villages lived by cultivating a very limited variety of domesticated plants and animals, they were at the mercy of droughts, floods, and pestilence. Peasants were obliged to produce more than they consumed so that they could build up reserves. Without grain in the silo, jars of olive oil in the cellar, cheese in the pantry, and sausages hanging from the rafters, they would starve in bad years. And bad years were bound to come sooner or later. A peasant living on the assumption that bad years would not come did not live long. Consequently, from the very advent of agriculture, worries about the future became major players in the theater of the human mind. Where farmers depended on rains to water their fields, the onset of the rainy season meant that each morning the farmers gazed toward the horizon, sniffing the wind and straining their eyes. Is that a cloud? Would the rains come on time? Would there be enough? Would violent storms wash the seeds from the fields and batter down the seedlings? Meanwhile, in the valleys of the Euphrates, Indus, and Yellow rivers, other peasants monitored, with no less trepidation, the height of the water. They needed the rivers to rise in order to spread the fertile topsoil washed down from the highlands and to enable their vast irrigation systems to fill with water. But floods that surged too high or came at the wrong time could destroy their fields as much as a drought. Peasants were worried about the future, not just because they had more cause for worry, but also because they could do something about it. They could clear another field, dig another irrigation canal, sow more crops. The ancient and anxious peasants were as frantic and hard-working as a harvester in the summer, sweating to plant olive trees whose oil would be pressed by his children and grandchildren, putting off until the winter or the following year the eating of the food he craved today. The stress of farming had far reaching consequences. It was the foundation of a large scale political and social system. Sadly, the diligent peasants almost never achieved the future economic security they so craved through their hard work in the present. Everywhere, rulers and elites sprang up, living off the peasants' surplus food and leaving them with only a bare subsistence. These fortified food surpluses fueled politics, war, art, and philosophy. They built palaces, forts, monuments, and temples. Until the late modern era, more than 90% of humans were peasants who rose each morning to till the land by the sweat of their brows. The extra they produced fed the tiny minority of elites. Kings, government officials, soldiers, priests, artists, and thinkers who fill the history books. History is something that very few people have been doing while everyone else was plowing fields and carrying water buckets. I'm going to call it. We will continue chapter 6 when I'm not so tired.